Every country on Earth is drowning in debt. $38 trillion in the United States, $9 trillion in Japan, $315 trillion worldwide. 3 times the size of the entire global economy. And somehow, no one ever asks the most obvious question: if everyone owes money, who's owed? The answer isn't a country, a king, or a government. It's a system, one so perfectly designed that it traps every nation, every citizen, and every generation inside it. This system wasn't built overnight. It was engineered, step by step, by 4 men across 3 centuries: William Paterson, Nathan Rothschild, J.P. Morgan, and Paul Volcker. Each one added a layer of control until debt became not a problem, but the foundation of the global economy. They built a world where governments can never repay what they owe, because the act of repayment would collapse the very money they use. A world where interest never stops flowing upward, from taxpayers to bankers, from nations to institutions, from workers to wealth. What started as a loan to a desperate king in 1694 evolved into the Bank of England, the Federal Reserve, the IMF, and a web of obligations so tangled that default would destroy civilization itself. This isn't conspiracy, it's architecture. A system so elegant, so self-sustaining, that escape is impossible. Tonight, we follow the 4 architects who built it and uncover how the world's greatest financial illusion became the cage we all live in. In the final years of the 17th century, England was running out of money. The country was at war with France, the treasury was empty, and the crown's reputation for repayment was shattered. Kings had always borrowed from merchants and nobles, but when they couldn't pay, they simply defaulted. The creditors lost money, the king found new lenders, and life went on. Debt was temporary, risky for the rich, embarrassing for rulers, but containable. Then came a man named William Paterson, a Scottish trader, adventurer, and failed speculator who had one idea too radical for his time. What if debt didn't have to end? What if the crown could borrow forever and simply pay interest, using the people's taxes to fund it? In 1691, he proposed his vision to King William III, who desperately needed to finance a new war with France. 3 years later, in 1694, the plan became law, and the Bank of England was born. Paterson's proposal was simple, but revolutionary. A syndicate of wealthy merchants would lend the government £1.2 million, roughly $300 million in today's terms. In exchange, the government would pay 8% interest per year, not for a fixed term, but indefinitely. The principal would never be repaid. In effect, the crown was selling a stream of tax revenue in perpetuity. To manage this arrangement, the Bank of England was granted a royal charter. It would hold the merchants' gold, lend it to the government, collect interest from the treasury, and distribute that interest to the lenders. The merchants received a piece of paper, an IOU from the state, and that IOU could be traded, sold, or used as collateral. For the first time in history, government debt itself became money. The implications were staggering. England had found a way to fund endless wars without ever repaying its creditors. The debt would roll over, the interest would flow, and as long as Parliament could tax its citizens, the stream would never dry up. This wasn't just a financial innovation, it was the birth of permanent debt, a feature, not a flaw, of the system. The merchants had essentially bought an annuity backed by the nation's future productivity. And for them, it was risk-free. The government's promise was secured by its ability to extract taxes at gunpoint. But Paterson's real genius came in the second phase of his design. The Bank of England was given the power to issue banknotes backed by that government debt. The Crown's IOUs became the foundation of the nation's money supply. The more the government borrowed, the more banknotes could be printed, and the more liquidity flowed into the economy. Debt became money, and money became debt. It was a feedback loop that made borrowing not just possible, but necessary for growth. Within a few decades, the model spread across Europe, France, the Netherlands, and later the young United States under Alexander Hamilton copied it, turning public debt into a cornerstone of state power. The Bank of England's original loan of £1.2 million was never repaid. In fact, the British government still carries it on its books today, over 330 years later. Paterson died in 1719, not particularly rich, but the machine he created outlived him and reshaped civilization. By transforming royal IOUs into national currency, William Paterson made debt immortal, and with that one innovation, he created the first true financial prison, a world where taxpayers, not kings, would forever fund the interest payments of empire. The debt trap was open. All it needed now was scale. By the dawn of the 19th century, William Paterson's invention had spread across Europe, but it was still fragmented. Governments borrowed through personal networks, loans were negotiated one by one, and the market for sovereign debt was small, unstable, and local. Then came the man who would industrialize it, Nathan Mayer Rothschild, the fourth son of a German money changer from Frankfurt. While Paterson made debt permanent, Rothschild made it global. He built the first financial information network, mastered the timing of wars and peace, and turned government borrowing into an industry. The Rothschild family was unlike any other financial dynasty in history. By 1800, the five Rothschild brothers had established banks in London, Paris, Frankfurt, Vienna, and Naples, creating a trans-European web that could move money faster than any government or army. When the Napoleonic Wars broke out, that network became their weapon. Nathan, stationed in London, supplied gold to Britain's allies fighting Napoleon, and when governments needed to borrow, he didn't just lend, he created the market for lending. His innovation was the secondary bond market. Instead of a single, risky loan to the crown, Rothschild would purchase government bonds at a discount, then resell them to investors, insurance companies, pension funds, and the aristocracy at a markup. The government received immediate cash, investors received tradable assets, and Rothschild pocketed the spread. This was revolutionary. It transformed sovereign debt from a private agreement into a mass market investment. For the first time, the wealth of entire nations flowed through a handful of bankers who set the prices, the terms, and the access. The British consols, French rentes, and Austrian bonds became the backbone of European finance. Every government depended on Rothschild's network to sell its debt. Without it, they couldn't fight wars, build empires, or even pay their civil servants. But Rothschild's power didn't come just from money, it came from information. During the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, Nathan Rothschild received news of Napoleon's defeat a full day before the British government. Using his network of couriers and carrier pigeons, he acted before anyone else could. He quietly sold British bonds, creating panic in the market as investors assumed Britain had lost. Prices collapsed. Then, when the panic peaked, Rothschild bought everything back at fire sale prices. When news of victory arrived the next day, bond prices soared. His fortune multiplied overnight. Whether the legend was exaggerated or not, the truth was undeniable. Control of information meant control of markets. Within a decade, the Rothschilds dominated European sovereign debt issuance. No major power could borrow without them. They had achieved what Paterson never could. They made default politically and economically impossible. If one nation refused to pay, it wasn't just one lender who lost. It was an entire international system of investors, banks, and governments. Default became a systemic event. Debt had become too interconnected to fail. By 1820, the Rothschild network effectively ran the financial arteries of Europe. Governments borrowed endlessly to pay the interest on previous loans. Wars were fought, empires expanded, railways and canals were built, all financed by debt that would never be repaid. By the mid-1800s, the Rothschilds were the richest family in the world, controlling more capital than any monarchy on earth. They didn't need to rule nations, they owned their bonds. The Rothschild model industrialized Paterson's concept. Permanent debt was now profitable, scalable, and self-sustaining. The trap had become invisible, woven into the structure of finance itself. By making bonds global, Nathan Rothschild ensured that no government could default without collapsing the world around it. The debt trap was no longer national, it was universal. By the early 1900s, the system William Paterson had invented and Nathan Rothschild had perfected was operating on a global scale, but it still had one fatal limitation: demand. Governments could borrow only as long as private banks had money to lend. When liquidity dried up, markets crashed. When confidence vanished, nations stopped. Then came John Pierpont Morgan, the man who built the mechanism that would remove that limitation forever: the central bank. The Panic of 1907 was Morgan's stage. Stocks collapsed, banks failed, and depositors lined up in panic outside New York trust companies. The government was paralyzed. There was no Federal Reserve, no lender of last resort. So Morgan did it himself. He locked the city's most powerful bankers inside his library and refused to let them leave until they pledged their personal fortunes to rescue the system. It worked. The crash stopped, the markets recovered, and Morgan became the de facto central banker of the United States. But he was 70 years old. He knew that when he died, the system would fall back into chaos. What he needed wasn't another bailout. It was a permanent institution that could create money on command. In 1910, Morgan's allies met in secret on Jekyll Island, Georgia. The guest list read like a financial coup. Senator Nelson Aldrich representing the government, Frank Vanderlip of National City Bank, Henry Davison, and Paul Warburg representing the Morgan and Kuhn-Loeb empires. For 9 days, they drafted the blueprint for what would become the Federal Reserve System. The genius of their plan was in its disguise. Americans despise central banks. They had killed 2 of them before, so the new institution wouldn't be called a central bank at all. It would be a system, decentralized, democratic on paper, and publicly overseen. In reality, it would be privately owned by member banks and governed by insiders. When Congress passed the Federal Reserve Act in 1913, few lawmakers understood what they had created. The Fed would buy government bonds with money it printed itself. In doing so, it could create infinite demand for government debt. The Treasury would issue bonds. The Fed would purchase them using newly created dollars, and those dollars would circulate as reserves throughout the banking system. Debt was now literally being turned into money, a seamless continuation of Paterson's idea, but on a global industrial scale. The transformation was profound. Before 1913, government borrowing was limited by the amount of private capital in the market. After 1913, the limit disappeared. The United States could borrow without constraint, finance wars without raising taxes, and roll its debt indefinitely because the buyer, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, would never run out of money. It didn't need savings, it needed only confidence. When World War I erupted a year later, the system was tested, and it worked flawlessly. The U.S. Treasury issued unprecedented volumes of war bonds, and the Fed absorbed them. Interest payments flowed to the very banks that owned shares in the reserve system. The government's debt became the base money of the nation. Debt and currency merged completely. J.P. Morgan died in 1913, the same year the Fed was born. His name was carved into history not for creating wealth, but for creating the machine that makes debt infinite. The United States would never again face a true credit shortage, and the global economy would never again run without the constant hum of borrowing. Morgan didn't just stabilize finance. He ensured that from that day forward, the world would need debt to survive. By the late 1970s, the system J.P. Morgan had helped engineer was operating flawlessly, and that was the problem. Governments could borrow endlessly, banks could create credit without restraint, and inflation was eroding faith in the dollar itself. The United States, burdened by the costs of the Vietnam War and the collapse of the Bretton Woods gold standard, was drowning in cheap money. Prices were soaring, confidence was collapsing, and the world was beginning to question the foundation of the system. That's when Paul Volcker, a tall, quiet economist, who became chairman of the Federal Reserve in 1979, made the most brutal move in modern financial history. Volcker believed the only way to save the dollar was to kill inflation, no matter the cost. Within months, he raised the federal funds rate from 11% to nearly 20%, the highest level in American history. The results were immediate and catastrophic. Mortgage rates hit 18%, unemployment spiked, businesses failed, and the U.S. economy plunged into a deep recession. But the policy worked, inflation broke, and confidence in the dollar was restored. What few people realized was that Volcker's decision didn't just crush inflation, it weaponized global debt. During the 1970s, developing nations across Latin America, Asia, and Africa had borrowed billions in dollar-denominated loans from American and European banks. The money was cheap, interest rates were low, and the banks were eager to lend. But when Volcker's rate hikes hit, those loans became unpayable overnight. Countries like Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina suddenly faced interest bills larger than their export earnings. In August 1982, Mexico announced it could no longer make its payments. The world stood on the brink of a financial collapse. If Mexico defaulted, the biggest U.S. banks, Citibank, Chase Manhattan, and Bank of America, would face massive losses. The entire Western banking system was at risk. Volcker could have let the market clear, forcing the banks to take their losses. Instead, he and his allies crafted a new mechanism of control. The International Monetary Fund, IMF, stepped in as savior, but it wasn't rescuing Mexico, it was rescuing the banks. The IMF issued billions in structural adjustment loans, not to reduce debt, but to ensure that debtor nations could continue servicing the interest on their old loans. In exchange, countries were forced to slash spending, privatize state assets, open markets to foreign investors, and devalue their currencies. The terms were brutal. Education, healthcare, and wages collapsed while foreign corporations bought national industries for pennies. This was the Volcker innovation, a global extension of the debt trap. Instead of forgiving or writing off unpayable debt, the system would restructure it indefinitely. The interest would keep flowing, sovereignty would be traded for liquidity, and countries that couldn't pay were trapped in a cycle of dependency. The IMF became the global collection agency of the financial elite, enforcing policies that benefited creditors under the guise of economic reform. The results were staggering. By the late 1980s, nearly 40 developing nations were under IMF supervision. Entire regions had been turned into collateral. Mexico's debt was rolled over, Brazil's assets were privatized, Argentina's currency was dismantled, and the Western banking system emerged richer than ever. Volcker's rate shock had transformed debt from a financial contract into a tool of global governance. When Paul Volcker died in 2019, he was remembered as the man who saved the dollar. But history will remember something else, that he made the debt trap permanent. He completed the system Paterson, Rothschild, and Morgan began, turning it into a structure so vast that no country could escape without collapsing its economy. From that point on, debt wasn't just an obligation, it was the operating system of the world. Today, the system built by Paterson, Rothschild, Morgan, and Volcker has expanded into every corner of the planet. It no longer belongs to any single country, government, or central bank. It's an organism, a self-replicating financial network that feeds on debt. As of 2025, global debt stands at over $315 trillion, 3 times the size of the world's GDP. The United States alone owes $38 trillion, Japan, $9 trillion, Europe, $14 trillion. But when you trace who actually holds that debt, something astonishing appears. The world doesn't owe money to anyone in particular. It owes money to itself. And yet the interest still flows upward, enriching a small group of institutions that manage the cycle. Start with the United States. Roughly $20 trillion of U.S. debt is held by the domestic public, pension funds, insurance companies, investment firms, and the Federal Reserve itself. The other $18 trillion is intragovernmental debt, meaning the government owes it to its own programs like Social Security and Medicare. It's a circular structure, the left hand owing the right, but the consequences are very real. Every year, American taxpayers send about $1 trillion in interest payments to bondholders. That money doesn't go to building roads or schools, it goes to servicing old debt. And those bondholders, directly or through funds, are overwhelmingly the wealthy, the top 10% of households, and the institutional giants who manage their capital. Globally, the same loop exists. Japan's government debt is held mostly by the Bank of Japan and domestic institutions. Europe's debt sits on the balance sheets of its own banks and the European Central Bank. China's debt is owned by state banks. Every nation issues bonds, their central banks buy them, and their taxpayers fund the interest. The ownership lines are so intertwined that every country effectively owes every other country, and all of them owe the same global creditors. The web includes the world's largest asset managers: BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, and Fidelity. Together, they control over $30 trillion in assets and hold massive positions in government bonds worldwide. They use the savings of ordinary workers, retirement accounts, mutual funds, insurance premiums, to buy public debt. The interest payments then flow back to them in the form of management fees and compounding returns. It's a perfectly legal mechanism for transferring wealth upward. But here's the paradox that keeps the trap locked. If the US government tried to pay off its debt, it couldn't. The act of repayment would destroy the money supply. Every dollar in circulation today originates from debt, government bonds purchased by the Fed or private investors. If those bonds were repaid and retired, the dollars they created would vanish. The economy would collapse overnight. The same is true globally. If every government balanced its books, global money supply would shrink by 2/3. Trade would freeze. Banks would implode. The system would seize because its existence depends on perpetual borrowing. Debt isn't a mistake. It's the raw material of money itself. And so the interest keeps flowing. From workers to taxpayers, from taxpayers to treasuries, from treasuries to bondholders, and from bondholders to the financial institutions that manage it all. It's invisible because it doesn't appear as a tax. It's called debt service. Yet in substance, it's the largest and most consistent wealth transfer in human history. $1 trillion a year in the United States alone, funneled quietly from labor to capital. The modern debt web is a mirror of the global economy itself, complex, self-sustaining, and utterly inescapable. Every country is both a debtor and a creditor. Every crisis creates new borrowing, and every bailout ensures the system's survival. The world doesn't need to escape the trap anymore. The trap has become the world. For more than 3 centuries, every major economic reform, every crisis, and every bailout has deepened the same design. The world's financial system isn't broken. It's functioning exactly as intended. What began as a royal loan in 1694 has evolved into a planetary algorithm. Governments borrow, central banks create money, taxpayers pay interest, and the process repeats forever. It's not corruption, it's architecture. Debt is no longer a temporary condition, it's the foundation of civilization. The illusion of escape still exists, of course. Politicians talk about balancing budgets, reducing deficits, or paying down national debt. But these are rituals, not solutions. The math makes them impossible. To pay off its $38 trillion debt, the United States would have to erase the very dollars that circulate through its economy. Every bond retired removes money from the system. A true debt-free society would have no money, no liquidity, and no trade. The global economy would implode within weeks. Default isn't an option either. The network is too interconnected. A missed payment in one country would ripple through pensions, banks, and insurance funds in another. The collapse wouldn't be national, it would be systemic. That leaves one path: perpetual refinancing. Governments roll over old debt by issuing new debt, central banks keep buying bonds, and citizens keep paying taxes to fund the interest. The process is infinite by design. It keeps economies running, stock markets rising, and wealth flowing upward. Every time the system nears failure, it resets itself through inflation, bailouts, or austerity, wiping out savers and middle-class wealth while preserving the structure for those who own it. The names change, the policies evolve, but the core equation remains untouched. Debt grows, interest compounds, and power concentrates. The modern architects, institutions like the Federal Reserve, European Central Bank, IMF, and World Bank, play their roles flawlessly. When markets crash, they create liquidity. When currencies wobble, they intervene. When governments falter, they lend. But they never let the system contract enough to break. The result is an illusion of control. Recessions feel temporary, crises are absorbed, and the public remains calm. Meanwhile, the real cost is hidden in inflation, inequality, and the erosion of sovereignty. Nations no longer control their destinies. Their fiscal policies are bound by the expectations of bond markets. Their social programs are limited by credit ratings. Their freedom is priced in basis points. And yet, this dependence is celebrated as progress. Economists call it monetary stability. Politicians call it growth. The truth is darker. The system's success depends on your perpetual participation, your labor, your taxes, your belief that this is normal. You don't need to be coerced to serve it. You only need to live within it. Debt is the rent we pay to exist in their world. When Paul Volcker died in 2019, obituaries praised him for saving the dollar. They didn't mention that his policies cemented the architecture of global debt, locking billions of people into a structure they can't leave. But that's how history remembers its builders, not as conspirators, but as saviors. From Paterson to Rothschild, from Morgan to Volcker, 4 men turned credit into control, and their system has outlived them all. So the next time you hear a leader promise to fix the debt, remember this: it's not meant to be fixed, it's meant to function. The trap was never designed to close, it was designed to hold. The only way to escape it would be to rebuild civilization itself from zero. Until then, the interest will keep flowing, the bonds will keep rolling, and the architects will keep winning, quietly, efficiently, forever.